Welcome to Nadir Audio. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the Hall Analogue A3 hybrid phono preamp. So let's get started. So I first heard about the A3 a couple of years ago when I read about it in Stereophile magazine, and at the time I was really intrigued by this sort of hybrid tube design built around these two 12AU7 tubes, and also the description of the sound. And I also thought it was a really cool looking unit with this brushed metal finish, but it has some 80s flourishes with these red stripes around the volume and power knobs. And it also has this cool system functional block diagram printed on top, which is something that manufacturers used to do in the day that I always thought was kind of neat. Now at the time, the list price of this unit was about $1,200. And I hadn't really done a lot of exploring of less expensive phono preamps in the audiophile range, and I wanted to do a little bit of that first before I bought a more expensive unit. So I sort of tucked this away in the back of my mind as something that I might want to upgrade to down the road. And then when it went on sale earlier this year for $850, I decided to pull the trigger and go ahead and get one. And I actually got this particular one from Music Direct as an open box unit for $750, and at that price I think it's a really good deal. So one other cool thing about the A3 is that it comes with this rather nice travel case. Now this is not really something I need. I'm not going to be traveling with my phono preamp or moving anytime soon, but it is nice to have a case if it ever goes out of regular rotation in my system. I have a good place to store it, keep it safe, and keep dust off of it. So it's a nice bonus. So for all the listening tests I did in this video, I've been using my U-Turn Orbit turntable with an Ortophon 2M Blue cartridge. Now I did make a video a few months ago about upgrading from the 2M Red that came with this turntable to the 2M Blue, and in my opinion that's a pretty major upgrade, so I'll include a link to that video in the description below if you want to check that out. Now from the turntable we're going into the A3, and then the A3 is running into my Saga preamp, and then my Vidar power amp, and then for speakers we're using the Triangle Bro 3s, which is a pretty good setup. And then for comparisons, I'm comparing against this Manny phono preamp. I did make a video about this a few months ago as well. I'll include a link below. Now I know that's not a very fair comparison. Even at the reduced price, the A3 is several times more expensive than the Manny. But I think it is helpful to give the general sound character of these and what you're getting from the A3. I am planning to try out other phono preamps in the A3's price range down the road, so when we do that we'll compare directly against preamps that maybe stand up a little better. But for now, that's what I've got, so that's what I'm using. Now one other interesting thing about the A3 is you'll notice that it has a volume knob, which is unusual for phono preamps. And the idea is that you can go directly from the A3 to a power amp like the Vidar and eliminate the need for a separate preamp. So you're removing one component from the chain, which the idea is that it will give you a purer, better sound. Now we are going to try that out, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the video. But to start out, we're going to be using the setup I just described. So I've had the A3 for a few months now, and as soon as I got it, I plugged it into my system and I immediately liked it. I started listening a lot more to my vinyl collection. I was finding it more engaging. And one of the things that was obvious right off the bat is that it is a more resolving preamplifier than the Manny 3. So in conjunction with the 2M Blue cartridge, it's just extracting a lot more information from the grooves, so you can hear a lot more of those micro details. And similarly, you get a lot more air around the instruments. That's something I talk a lot about on this channel, but that's sort of room sound. So the soundstage is very similar to the Manny 3 in terms of size and placement, but everything sounds like it's in a room rather than just things kind of floating in free space next to one another. So you get a lot more of that, and you do get a tiny bit of tube holographicness, I would say. This is not a real tubey sounding preamp, I wouldn't say that, especially with the solid state system we're using today, but you get just a touch of that plus the air around the instruments, and that part is pretty obvious, and that's, you know, in classical recordings and jazz, that makes a huge difference. So recently, in doing some A-B comparisons with the Manny 3 and the A3, there's some other things that were less obvious that I've noticed. So one of which is that I think the A3 is more tonally correct than the Manny 3. The Manny tends to add a little bit of warmth to things that I think is maybe not in the original recording, whereas the A3, it's not at all clinical, it's not at all boring, it's not at all bright sounding, but everything just sounds a little bit more like the real instrument. So, you know, a saxophone sounds like a saxophone, piano sounds like a piano, violin like a violin. The Manny 3 is no slouch in that regard, but the A3 just takes things a little bit farther, and I find that adds to the sense of realism, and I really like that. And one thing I'll mention too is that for really dynamic recordings, and we're going to look at one here in just a minute, the A3 is really able to capture that full dynamic range, where I've noticed that the Manny 3 just compresses things a little bit, so you're not getting that full dynamic range that you would otherwise. That on really good recordings it is truly amazing, and it's something I really like. And again, that leads more into that realism, that feeling that there's real instruments, a real room, that sort of corporeality that I really like. So let's take a look at some specific recordings, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. So one of the recordings I listened to was Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra, conducted by Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Now this is an Analog Productions reissue of a Living Stereo title from the 50s. And if you're a fan of Bartók, it's an excellent performance, but it's also an excellent recording and a clear example of that full dynamic range. This is a very dynamic recording, and you can really hear that on the A3, going from quiet passages to really quite loud passages. And when you compare it listening on the Manny, you can definitely hear that compression. In addition, we get that correct tonality on all of the instruments, and also a lot of micro details. The timbre and tone of everything is correct, and it really adds to that realism in addition to the air that you can hear around the instruments and just the ambient sound of the room. This is probably the closest recording I've ever heard in my system to being there yourself, to really feeling like you're in the music hall. It's almost uncanny how good it is, and it's amazing that you can get that level of detail with the A3 and the Ortophon 2M Blue. So I listened to this several times. This is an amazing recording, highly recommended, and I highly recommend it with the A3 as well. So another record I listened to was Stochastic Drift by Barker. Now this is an electronic album I think I first heard about on John Darko's channel, but I really like the music, and it's a really good recording as well. Now this is an acoustic recording, so it's not real instruments in a real space, but it is very well recorded, and there's a lot of reverb and other types of subtle effects. And the A3 does an excellent job of getting a lot of those micro details that you just don't get with the Manny. So while both preamps can kind of give a muscular sound, and this is sort of a muscular recording and a driving recording, so both of them can kind of capture that, but it's really just all that extra detail around the individual. It's almost like there's individual electronic instruments and you're listening to a live performance, and so they are in an ambient space with space around them that you can actually hear into, whereas on the Manny you're not getting that part of it. So it just adds another dimension to this recording where it's a little bit more one-dimensional on the Manny. So this isn't as night and day as the difference on the Bartók recording, but it's not a subtle difference. It's a big improvement, and I really preferred listening to it on the A3. So the last record I'm going to talk about is Free For All by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And this is a classic example of a record that I really love the music, but I've always found the recording to be a little bit challenging. I've owned a CD copy of this for 25 years, and as my system got better and better over the years, I found that I would often run into listener fatigue. So as the title suggests, this is a very frenetic recording with lots of crazy drums, lots of screeching, high-pitched horns, and when you don't get that instrument separation and everything kind of is lopped together, it can be an excellent recipe for listener fatigue, and I've definitely experienced that. Sometimes, even though I love the music, I can't make it all the way through side 1 and side 2. Now, this is a Blue Note reissue on vinyl that I picked up a few months ago to see if maybe that would make a difference, and it really didn't make much of a difference, so I just have had it sitting on my shelf, not really listening to it. Now, when I was listening with the A3, I did listen to a lot of challenge recordings, and in general, the extra resolving power of the A3 actually would make the problems even worse. This was especially true for more modern recordings with lots of compression or distortion of the not good kind. But on this particular recording, I was surprised because it actually made it a lot better. And the reason is that there is actually a lot of low-level detail in this recording that my previous systems were not pulling out. And with the A3 and the 2M Blue, we were finally getting that extra information. And so, for example, the bass and the piano tend to be very muddy and back in the mix and just kind of leading to extra noise in the recording. Now I can finally hear them clearly. They're separated. They have some room sound, some air around them. Now they're not amazing. They're still recessed in the background. This is not the most amazing jazz recording I have. I have other recordings that sound a lot better. But the extra resolving power of the A3 actually helps this recording. It pulls some of those details that you can't normally pull out, and it makes it sound a lot better. So that was a big surprise to me. And I think that I'm going to be listening to a lot of my other jazz records because I can think of a couple of others that are similar to this, that the A3 may actually improve things. So overall, I really am happy with the A3. It's a major step up, and that's not surprising. It's much more expensive than the Manny, but I think at its new lower price, it's an excellent deal. It seems like it's currently out of stock at most places as of the time of this recording, but if you can get your hands on one for not too much, this is definitely going to be my new reference going forward. So I do have another turntable that I'm going to be reviewing soon, and we're going to be using the A3 with it. And so I'll have a video on that before the end of the year. But I think for this time, that's it for now. But thanks, guys, and I will see you all in the next video.